Hi, art nerds! Today we're going to do an Etegami painting of a beautiful purple iris. This photo was taken in my mom's flower bed. It's so nice to be able to appreciate the beautiful spring flowers without having to worry about getting sick from other people. So this is the iris that I'm going to be painting. Today's Etegami paper is on some unusual Etegami paper that I purchased while I was in Japan. This is super bleeding Etegami paper, and my Japanese is non-existent, so I used Google Translate to help me out, and they gave me a pretty good rough translation. They kept referring to the paper as pita, but basically this paper is designed to be ironed onto, say, a Japanese postcard or an index card if you have one. And then you can either paint on it and then iron it, or you can iron it first. So my Etegami painting is pretty wet, so I decided to iron it to some index cards first. And I was not sure whether it should be a dry iron or an iron with steam, so we decided to do an experimental one with a dry iron first. And that ended up working really, really well for me. And I decided to do several postcards so I wouldn't have to pull out the ironing board and iron them each time. Now, I am recording this not from my art studio in Nashville. I am actually in Louisiana. I'd come down here to help family out after a surgery, but, and I should be used to this because hurricane season does this to people all the time, I ended up kind of stranded here. I made the decision to cancel my flight back to Nashville and stay with my family during COVID to help them out and to be a resource for them for as long as I possibly can. So I don't have my usual resources here with me, so hopefully you guys will bear with the recording goofs. My mom was acting as my cameraman. Big thanks to her for being a spare set of hands. I really do appreciate it. So this is our ironed paper. I actually ironed it on the line side first because I wasn't sure how transparent it would be. My subsequent ones are all ironed on the other side with the lines on the back. So these are the materials that I'm going to use for today's Etegami tutorial. We've got our strange Etegami paper, and I'm going to link in the description where you can buy similar Etegami paper if you guys want to try this at home. You can also do this on if you have like washi paper, if you have mulberry paper, if you have Chinese watercolor paper, those would all work for this as well. You may want to do your painting first and then adhere it to a stronger support like a piece of cardstock or an index card once you finish your painting. I'm also working with the Mozart Como Rebi set. So generally, Etegami watercolor is designed to be worked with Gansai style watercolors, which we'll talk a little bit more in a bit. I also have some sumie brushes, as well as some Pentel pigment brushes, a pencil, some washi tape, a small plastic palette for just not necessarily mixing colors or mixing washes, just so much as a place where I can make sure the pigments are distributed on my brush and I don't just end up with a whole bunch of water, as well as some Canson XL watercolor paper. So I'm not going to use the watercolor paper. I actually want the chipboard on the back. So to prepare for my watercolor painting, I'm applying the tape to my arm. This is going to help reduce some of the tackiness, so it's not going to tear the paper or our card as much. And I'm going to place the tape on the back side of the index card so that it'll adhere to our Canson XL sketchbook. Once I've got everything taped down, I'm going to start sketching my iris. Just off camera, I have a laptop with my reference photo pulled up, and irises are a little bit unusual in that I don't start with a circular shape and then break it down into petals. I actually start with a triangular shape and then break it down into petals because irises have those 3 large petals that branch off, and then from the center you have 3 smaller petals kind of interspersed between the larger ones. And something just absolutely beautiful about Etegami paper is or Etegami as an art form, is that it's meant to be these heartfelt, hand-painted postcards that we send to one another. Perfection is absolutely not necessary, but there is a goal to kind of capture the seasonality of the time of year you're sending the postcard in. So I've been painting a lot of spring flowers. So you guys saw my beautiful iris sketch. Again, it does not have to be perfect. And another beautiful thing about this is that when you're painting it, it's really about capturing an impression rather than going super realistic or super detailed. So this is a wonderful project for people who would like to try watercolor but are maybe not so confident in their watercolor skills. So earlier I mentioned Gansai style watercolors. Gansai style watercolors are traditional Japanese watercolors. When they are sold, like the Kuretake Gansai Tambi set or the Akashia Gansai set, those are sold primarily for making Etegami postcards. And these use a different binder than Western watercolors, which usually use like gum arabic or honey or maybe even dextrin. These use Nikuma, which is an animal glue, and it just works as a different sort of binder. They're really designed to be painted much more thickly than Western style watercolors. So for those of you who have added a lot of water to your Gansai Tambis and you wonder why they turn to soup, that's not how they're designed to be used. They're designed to be used very thickly. So I applied a wash of green to the background, and now I'm going to dab in some color wet into wet to imply the stalks and the leaves of the iris plants surrounding this iris blossom. Now, this paper is very, very, very bleedy. That's how it's designed to be. It's not a flaw. It is part of its character. And I definitely maybe worked a little bit too wet, but I also wanted to see how good the adhesion would be between the paper and the card that I ironed it to. So I gave that plenty of time to dry, and adding that much water, it really did take a long time to dry. And now I'm going in with a turquoise green. I want you guys to notice that the paper is starting to pill and tear up a little bit. That's because I way oversaturated this paper with water. I've never used this particular paper before, and I'm kind of just experimenting with a bunch of the different Etegami papers I've picked up over the years. So sometimes it's monkey see, monkey not do. Don't necessarily do as I do. Take a page from my book and learn from my mistakes. So some Etegami papers can take more water than others, but just in general, you're going to want to work with really, really thick mixes, way thicker than you would with Western style watercolors. So this could also be great for watercolor sets that are very cheap and have a lot of optical brighteners, because the intention isn't to do a lot of layers. The intention isn't to do a lot of color mixing. So watercolors that are generally kind of muddy to use might work really well in this instance. So while I wait for the background to dry, I'm brushing in just a little bit of the yellow on the irises in the centers, and I'm going to hopefully leave a halo of white around that. While it's still wet, I'm going in with just a little bit of a warmer yellow, almost an orange, so it diffuses out into the yellow. All right, so that is our background and our yellow accent. So now I'm going to start working on the stem, and I want it to be distinct from the background, so I'm going in with a cool yellow first. I'm also adding some yellow highlights to the leaves surrounding the iris, just to add a little bit more color. So you might have noticed that this iris is a fairly light lavender color primarily, and my set does not include a fairly light lavender color. So I did what I told you guys not to do, but it actually worked in my favor this time. I did create a lighter wash of our purple to apply to our iris. And this is gonna bleed out a whole lot. The wetter your mixture, the more it's gonna bleed on most of these papers. While that's still very wet, I'm dabbing in a much more saturated mix of dioxine purple or dark purple so it can bleed out. I also want to point out to you guys, this video has been time-lapsed. It's only been time-lapsed by 2. So if you're doing Etegami paper or painting, you want to give yourself about an hour. If you live in more humid areas like the Gulf Coast, it's going to take about 2 hours just because of dry times. So it can be a great activity where you start the background and then you go do something else for a while, then you come back to it and you paint the flower. But it's a fairly short art activity, and I feel like the end results are so much better than the hour you invest. You know what I mean? Like, you really get a lot out of that hour that you put in. So I'm dabbing in some really thickly mixed azure blue. It's like a Prussian blue color, so a very cool blue, into the background just to create a little bit more definition in the leaves surrounding the iris. So that blue thing in the corner there, that's actually my laptop. I brought it closer so I could see what I was doing. So there is proof that I actually do use reference, and I do recommend that you guys utilize reference. There's nothing wrong with using reference. I love painting flowers from photos that I've taken. I love taking photos of flowers. It's one of my hobbies. I have a membership to Cheekwood Botanical Garden. I love exploring my mom's flower bed. She always has really nice flowers. And I love taking photos of beautiful flowers that I see on walks. And painting the flowers that I've taken photos of lets me utilize the photos that I've taken. So the iris has had a chance to dry somewhat, but not entirely. So the paper is not as wet, but it's still very wet. And I'm dabbing in a much thicker concentration of that dioxine violet. So we're getting more shadows and we're getting more of a diffused blend. And I'm really selecting my colors and my shadow application based on the photo. I just really liked how the photo looked, so I'm really leaning heavily on it for reference. To the stem, I'm also I added some green, now I'm adding some yellow back just to get this sort of really lively sort of spring green. So that's our iris basically blocked in. I actually wet the paper so much that I allowed it to dry overnight, and I came back to it the next morning to add my finishing touches and to ink it. Now I know allowing something to dry overnight might not be feasible if you have pets who get into everything or if you have kids who get into everything. So something you can do if you have a closet or if you have a cabinet is you can put the painting in there and let it dry overnight, and it'll keep it away from inquisitive pets and inquisitive little hands. So since it's dried overnight, I'm going in with a much smaller brush. This is a Boku Undo. I think it's a Boku Undo Menso brush, but I know it is a Menso brush. It could be a Kuretake Menso brush. And I am applying a really, really thick, basically straight from the pan mix of that dark purple, just to add those final shadows, those sharper shadows. Now keep in mind, we're not going for perfection. We're not going for photorealism. We're going to ink this thing. So we're just going for a soft, hazy impression. And this paper is beautiful for that. I wish Monet had access to washi paper. Who knows what he would have been able to create with those sort of soft, diffusing pigments. And fun fact for you guys, a lot of those great classic, not Renaissance era, but after Renaissance era painters like Van Gogh or Monet, a lot of them were very inspired by Japanese art that was being imported and resold. They were very inspired by that. So the tradition of being inspired by other cultures is not a new thing, and it's not necessarily something you just have to root out of yourself. Speaking of, I should have said this way earlier on because I know some of you just have never encountered this before, so you won't know. But etegami is a Japanese art form, and it's one I find very relaxing and very enjoyable. So I really encourage you guys to Google etegami, to look up other artists who create etegami art on YouTube and feel inspired. Allow their work to inspire you. There's all sorts of cool things you can do with this. And something I would like to learn in the near future is, I think it's, I have to look up the name again. I do apologize. I've been seeing ads for it all over Instagram. It's basically creating beautiful torn paper illustrations using chirigami paper and chirigami paper and washi paper. And that feels like a really amazing next step from this. And maybe I can do some cool mixed media applications with that. So that's another more relaxing art form than making comics. That I want to learn how to do. So at this point, I'm just kind of adding some azure blue details. I'm also blocking in some areas with the azure blue. It's fairly thickly mixed, so I wouldn't call it a glaze. But colors do dry a lot more transparent on this paper than they would if you were, again, doing Western style watercolors on a cellulose paper or a cotton rag paper. So don't be afraid to really slop it on. It handles the paint a lot better than you would expect given how thin it is. So you can see those layers dried a lot lighter and a lot thinner than you would have expected by how much I was really just slathering it on. I allowed it to dry fully, and now I'm going to ink it using the Pentel Pigment Extra Fine brush. I've mentioned in some of the other etegami videos that I've recorded recently that this brush handles a lot, this brush pen handles a lot like a brush. So this could be a great option for people who would like to try brush inking. They would like to get more gestural and looser with their inking, but they're afraid of maybe the mess or the financial commitment that inking with a brush usually entails. And I'm not going for like Western style pen and ink watercolor where everything is very tight and everything is very defined. I'm going for very loose and very gestural, which is one of the things that makes this so fun. And I also love how the inks just sort of transform the piece and make it feel more finished. right, so we are just about done with this beautiful iris Etegami postcard. I had a lot of fun painting it with you guys. I hope you guys found this to be a very accessible watercolor tutorial, because one of my goals here on the channel is I firmly believe that everyone should learn an art form. It should be something that is available and accessible to anyone who wishes to learn. And I believe that visual arts should be taught in schools and should be taught better in schools and should be more accessible in schools. It should be a basic skill like math. And while I know not everyone is capable of doing math, and I know not everyone would necessarily be capable of doing art, there is something really important about putting it out there and making it a viable option. I legitimately believe that if more people had art as a hobby, it would be easier to make art as a living because people would understand what it takes. Yes, it is a passion, it's a vocation, it comes from the heart, but hard work and labor and dedication and education do deserve a reward. So I enjoyed walking you guys through this. I enjoyed painting it. It was a great source of relaxation for me, and I have a feeling for every day that I am in self-isolation, I will probably paint an Etegami postcard, so you can look forward to many more of these to come. I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out with me this evening. If you're interested in more easy watercolor projects and tutorials, I have a quick and easy watercolor playlist that I highly recommend you guys check out. And if you're interested in really deep diving into watercolor for comics or illustration, I have a watercolor basics playlist that you guys should check out. So I hope you guys will give Etegami a try. I'll have a materials list down in the description, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye!